So, welcome everyone tonight to Backyard Blueberries. Let's go ahead and dive right on in. So, it usually takes a little while. There we go, for my slides to switch over. So, we're going to get started with a really brief introduction on blueberries with a little history tied into that before we really move on or get into things like varieties, establishment, care and maintenance. And then lastly, we'll wrap things up with some information on harvest and then a few tips for having a successful planting. So one of the fun things about blueberries is that it is one of the only foods or one of the very few foods that is naturally blue. And that blue coloring really lends itself well to making this a healthy food option in that it is high in antioxidants, anthocyanins to be specific, and it therefore has anti-aging properties as well. It's also really good for vision and digestion. But really, the focus is on prevention of some of our more serious diseases, such as cardiovascular and Alzheimer's disease, as well as cancer. And so blueberries are, again, really delicious to eat, but they're also really helpful and healthy for us as well. So this wonderberry, as I like to call them, the Native Americans actually used to call them starberries, are in the same family as cranberry and bilberry. This is where you'll also find other plants that you may be familiar with, such as azaleas, mountain laurels, and rhododendrons as well. So blueberries are actually native to North America, and the Native Americans really recognized they were the first ones to find them useful, and they actually use them quite a lot as flavoring and for other purposes such as medicinally. And so, again, this one has been known in the past as starberries, but it's what we know today as blueberries. As you can see in that picture on the right, it kind of looks like a star where the fruit was attached to the plant. And so blueberries are actually produced on what we like to consider a perennial shrub. And they can actually live for quite a while, typically up to about 15 years in age. And they can reach heights of anywhere to 12 to 15 feet. However, we typically keep these greenbacks around 6 feet, and that is just to aid us in harvesting these delicious berries. These shrubs are actually comprised of several canes that actually come from the crown root area, which is there, as you can see in the picture on the left, kind of near that soil interface where the mulch we'll talk about in a minute and the soil come to meet. You'll find the roots in the crown in that general vicinity. So these shrubs are actually deciduous in nature, meaning that during the growing season, the leaves are green. They typically have a white underside. But once fall starts getting here, these leaves will go from green to orange to red in the fall, and then they'll eventually fall off in the winter season. And so they also have really distinctive white bell-shaped flowers that will eventually turn into the powdery blue fruit that most of us are really familiar with once they have been pollinated. And so an interesting side note is that powder that you often see on the blueberry has a name, and it's often referred to as the bloom. And that just further enhances the fruit's quality. And so now that we have a little backstory on blueberries, let's really look at varieties, because varieties are going to be important for setting the foundation for your blueberry planting. So before we get into really some of the most popular varieties that are grown here in Georgia, there are three main types: the southern highbush, the northern highbush, and rabbit eye. We first really need to talk a little bit about chilling hours. Chilling hours are generally recommended with fruit crops, and for blueberries, it's really going to vary depending on which variety you decide to go with. And so, just a little bit about chilling hours. Chilling hours are the number of hours that the temperatures we experience are between 45 degrees and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so during the year, these numbers are calculated for certain regions within our country. And as you can see over here on the right hand side, oftentimes it's put into maps where you can find that information out there. And so these chilling hours are really just going to determine when the flowers will be produced on that particular plant. And so, as you can guess, varieties that have very few chill hours often will bloom earlier, and those that need more chill hours will often bloom later. And so we're not going to really get into too much about chilling hour requirements. I really wanted you to know what they are and know that they are important. And so it's one of those considerations you need to make when selecting a variety. And this goes beyond just blueberry, but other fruit crops as well.
Ashley, this is Yanni. So I do hear a little bit of feedback, like your audio quality is not great. Do you have like, yeah, we do hear like a feedback from the microphone. So are you speaking from your laptop, or do you have a headphone, that kind of things?
Do not have a headphone. I wonder what is going on with my audio. I checked it before we started and it seems okay. Um, if it keeps being an issue, let me know and I'll try to figure out what the issue is. I'm sorry. Does it
Yeah.
sound like there's a lag or am I repeating myself?
So there's one participant said like your sound is coming from, like feels like you are like under the water. So it's kind of like you are speaking distantly. And some people have trouble understanding uh, what is said. So
Okay, can you hear me okay?
yeah, I do hear that feedback in the microphone. So
Okay.
yeah, can you check like your,
Yeah, give me just a quick second.
okay. So please give us several minutes and we will figure this out. Okay. Yeah, probably that is what we can do. If the audio doesn't work, I'll ask her to send me the PowerPoint so I can share the screen and she can present from her cell phone.
Hey, Yanni, what about now?
Oh, it's much better.
Oh, yay. Okay.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Sorry, everybody, about that. Do you need me to go back and repeat anything?
So yeah, give me some feedback in the chat box, please. Yeah, sound great now, but I think we can just start from the current slide. And
Okay.
then if they have questions, we can get them answered at the end. Yeah, much better. So continue your lecture. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, if there's anything that they didn't hear well, I'll be happy to go back and go over it again once we get done.
Okay.
Okay, so the first variety that we are going to really take a look at tonight is the Southern Highbush. This variety will actually offer some early season fruit. However, most times this is also early season fruit for wildlife as well. And so oftentimes homeowners have problems fending off deer and birds when it comes to growing this particular variety. So if you do grow it, you of course want to make sure that you have extra. Typically, This variety is self-fruitful. However, cross-pollination, as with most other fruit crops, oftentimes can help increase fruit size, but also fruit set. So that's something to keep in mind there. And by self-fruitful, I just mean that it doesn't necessarily need a partner to produce fruit. It can pollinate itself. However, cross-pollination is where you have a partner that will, again, help increase fruit set and fruit size. And so one of the drawbacks for Southern Habush is oftentimes it is considered challenging to grow. This particular variety is not as vigorous as Rabbit Eye, which I'll get to here in just a second. And because of that and crop loss due to late freezes, this one is typically limited to the South Georgia area. But I wanted to let you know that this is available here in Georgia. Wasn't sure if we had any participants from other areas of the state. But again, in say the Decatur, DeKalb County area, this one's probably not going to be the best option for you. So the next variety I wanted to talk to you about tonight is Northern Habush. Now, this is another variety that can be grown here in Georgia. This one's more geared towards northern Georgia, the mountain region, and colder areas of the U.S. This is where this one actually performs the best. Not so great for the Piedmont or the South Georgia area, and that is because this requires a higher chilling hour requirement than the other varieties that we're going to look at tonight, specifically Rabbit Eye, which we're going to get to next. This particular variety, just like Southern Habush, is also considered self-fruitful in that it doesn't necessarily need a partner. However, with a partner, oftentimes you can have an earlier harvest and larger fruit as well. So increased fruit set specifically. So the one I really want to talk about tonight is Rabbit Eye. And this one is actually going to be the focus of the rest of our talk, just because this one is the easiest for us to grow, especially homeowners. And that is because this particular variety is native to the Southeast, specifically Georgia, Alabama, Florida. This one is a really productive option, meaning that production is pretty high for this one, pretty consistent as well. It's also really tolerant of pests that we have here in Georgia and the environmental conditions that we have as well. And so again, this one is really just the best choice for home gardeners, less issues to contend with. One of the drawbacks with Rabbit Eye, however, is it does require cross-pollination. Therefore, it is going to require a partner. And so when you're selecting a partner for this particular variety, you want to make sure that they have overlapping bloom times so they can really help each other during pollination. And the chilling hour requirement for this one will vary anywhere from 400 to 650 hours. Again, you just want to be aware of that specific range when you're choosing varieties or cultivars, excuse me, and varieties as well. But some of the cultivars that I really wanted to bring to your attention tonight that are really suitable here in Georgia are ones such as Alapaha, Austin, Vernon, Titan. Notice that these are early season varieties, and so they're going to bloom fairly early. We also have mid to late season varieties such as Tiff Blue, Powder Blue, Centurion, Onslow. And these are not all the cultivars or cultivated varieties, so they're names that are out there for Rabbit Eye cultivars. And so this is a very kind of condensed list. And so something to keep in mind if you are wanting to extend your harvest season is that you can choose a couple of early season cultivars, mix them in with some late season cultivars, and really kind of extend your harvest depending on your situation and your need. However, if you do decide to use any of the early season cultivars, please keep in mind that these do bloom early in the season, and oftentimes they suffer damage from late spring freezes. Oftentimes this is the most limiting factor when it comes to just fruit production here in Georgia in general. But just keep that in mind when you're selecting your cultivars for your home planting. All right, so now that we know a little bit more about which varieties to plant and maybe some that aren't so great for our particular situations, let's move on to establishment, which includes things like site selection and preparation and planting. So a proper site for blueberries are going to need full sun. So you really want to make sure that whatever site you choose, that it gets at least 5 hours of sun per day. More would be better, especially when it comes to fruit production. You really want to make sure that you have good light access for fruit development. You also want to make sure that your blueberries are in well-drained soil. Blueberries do not like to have what we call wet feet, so they don't like saturated soils. And then lastly, you want to make sure that there's plenty of organic matter available for blueberries. And so really selecting a good site is going to set you up for a good foundation for your blueberry planting. With that in mind, you want to make sure that you're staying away from low areas in your yard and those that have poor air circulation. And by that I mean that they are not surrounded by objects such as fences or trees that really kind of cut off the air's ability to move on through. And this is because this can really lead to damage issues by diseases, but also frost and freezes. And then a little side note here is to keep in mind that cold air is really dense. And so it's going to flow downhill. And so if you have the option in your particular landscape to plant on an elevated site versus, say, a dip in your yard, you really want to go for that elevated site. So a really special requirement for blueberries is that they have a soil pH level between 4.2 and 5.2. They really like an acidic soil. And so to figure out where or what range your soil is in, it is highly recommended that if you are growing blueberries that you have your soil tested before planting. And if you haven't ever taken a soil test before, it's really easy, and you can go through your local extension office for this. But this is really fundamental for blueberry plantings and production, is that they have this soil range. Keep in mind, when you take the soil test, you want to make sure that you do it well ahead of planting. This should be done at least 3 to 6 months before planting, because it takes a while, if that pH needs to be adjusted, for those chemical reactions to happen in the soil. And you don't want this to be in the middle of production. You want this to be beforehand so that your soil is ready at planting. If you're choosing sites in your yard, if it's a place where you already have azaleas and camellias, know that your blueberries will generally do well there as well, but you still want to make sure that you have that soil test and you have those results ready to make sure, again, that you have the proper foundation to go forward. So with your site selected and your soil prepped, you want to make sure that you have blueberry plants that have been purchased from a reputable nursery, meaning that these plants are healthy and disease-free. And if you are planting rabbit eyes, that you have at least 2 different cultivars that, again, have overlapping bloom periods. And so when it comes to planting, you actually have 2 different time frames where you can be successful with blueberries. The first one is in the late fall. This is, generally more geared toward container grown blueberries. Or you could also plant in the late winter, early spring time frame. This goes for container and or bare root blueberries. And by bare root, we just mean when the plants are shipped to you, generally, they do not come in a container. Their roots are exposed. And so you want to make sure that you are doing it in a relatively downtime, meaning that they're not competing against the hot, humid weather that we often have here in Georgia. They have time for their roots to get established before they start plant growth. You also really want to make sure before planting that you have a weed-free and a grass-free area for your plants to go into. Blueberries are poor competitors when it comes to nutrients and water, and therefore you really want to make sure that you have a clean slate when it comes time for planting, so there's no competition going on there. And then lastly, make sure that your blueberries are staying well watered. Make sure to water them well before planting and then after planting. And we'll get more into the specifics of watering here in a little bit. So spacing between plants needs to be anywhere from 5 feet to 6 feet within the row. So if you have multiple plants, which with a rabbit eye you will, you want to make sure that you have at least 5 to 6 feet in between those plants. Now, if you plan on having more than just a couple of plants, if you're going to plant them in rows, you want to make sure that those rows are at least 10 to 12 feet apart. And this is just to make sure that these plants have adequate room for growth. And so when you're digging the hole, you want to make sure that it's at least 2 times wider than your pot or your root ball, depending on if you have a container grown or a bare root plant. If you do have a container grown blueberry and it seems like those roots might be a little bound up, if you can see that the roots are circling, you really want to make sure that you're loosening that up and cutting back or cutting the root ball in quartered sections to make sure that those circling roots don't continue to circle within your planting hole. And then keep in mind the depth should be about the same depth as that blueberry is in the container, or it should be the same height as the root ball. You don't want to plant it any deeper. So something interesting with blueberries that we don't often recommend is that you want to amend the planting hole. And so blueberries really love organic matter, some varieties more than other, but organic matter is always recommended when growing blueberries. And so for blueberries, you really want to make sure that you are adding this in at planting. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to add already moistened milled pine bark, or peat moss, or you can add them both, as long as it's about a 50-50 mix between that native soil that came out of the planting hole and then that pine bark and peat moss, or just peat moss mixture together. And that is what you are going to backfill your hole with. Again, blueberries love organic matter, and so you really want to make sure that that is added in. You can do this pre-plant as well. Instead of doing it per hole, you can actually do it over an area where you have a weed-free, grass-free area. You add this layer of organic matter over the area, and then you till it in. And that way you're not having to do it on a per hole basis. Again, you want to make sure that you're using either pine bark or peat moss to do this, or a combination of both. Do not use a potting mix that has lime included. So whatever you decide to use, make sure that you check the label and that it does not have lime. You do not want lime because that will actually raise the pH above the level that blueberries like, and you can actually end up with some plant issues because of that. Now, if your soil test does recommend that sulfur be added to help lower your soil pH, you can actually add this at the same time if you're doing a pre-plant soil amendment. So you're not having to do multiple tasks to get that soil or planting area prepared. So at planting, again, you'll want to make sure that you're adding that amended soil mix back into the planting hole. Of course, you want to gently pack it down around the base. And by base, I mean the root ball. So at the base of the plant. And then a step that gardeners often forget is to water it in after planting. That's really important. You want to make sure that you're settling that soil mix in around the roots and there are no air pockets left for the roots to dry out. A huge step also, besides watering it in after planting, is making sure that you're pruning it back. And this is really important because you want to remove any of the floral buds that may be on the plant. You don't want any flowers produced within that first year, because essentially the first year of blueberry production is to make sure that the plant is good and established. And then production can happen the second or third year. So besides pruning your plant back by a third to a half, depending on your particular situation, you want to make sure that you are also removing any twiggy growth and any tips. Again, you don't want any flower buds that first year. And then lastly, make sure that you're not applying fertilizer at planting. And this is also an important step because blueberries do not like to be over fertilized. They're very sensitive to fertilizer applications, and you can easily burn the roots of your blueberry plants, and that's what you do not want. So if your site is unfortunately has poor drainage, there are some options to kind of get around this. Again, blueberries like to have a well-drained soil. They don't like wet feet. However, you can get by in growing them in raised beds. It's an easy alternative, especially if you tend to have poor drainage. And so just constructing a raised bed, again, using the same materials, mixing in that pine bark or peat moss, to construct a raised bed will be really beneficial. Another option is that you can get away with growing blueberries in containers as well. These should at least be about 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide. Again, that soil mix is actually soulless, more so for your containers, and that you're using a 50-50 mix of that pine bark and peat moss. That's going to be the best potting mix if you're growing in a container. And so something to keep in mind with these two alternatives, if you don't have a well-suited site, is that oftentimes you're going to have to water these a lot more often than you would if you were growing them in ground. And so that's just a key factor that you don't want to forget about, is that they can dry out faster in either a raised bed or a container situation. All right, so now that we have our blueberries planted, let's look at how to care for and maintain them throughout the year. And so the first area I really wanted to look at for care and maintenance is fertilization, because again, blueberries can be easily damaged by over fertilization. And so you want to be mindful of when and how you apply fertilizers. You really want to stay away from nitrate-based fertilizers and instead go with either an ammonium sulfate or sulfur-coated urea. There's several options out there for azalea fertilizers or blueberry fertilizers that are also great options as well, as the nutrients are more suited for those two particular crops. And so when you're applying fertilizer, again, because they are so sensitive, you want to make sure that you are not just applying it to one area around the bush. You really want to make sure that you're broadcasting it evenly around the shrub, and always make sure that you're following the label so that you're making sure that that fertilizer is being used correctly. So again, it's always recommended to do a soil test before planting. Not only is it going to tell you what level your soil pH is, it's also going to give you fertilizer recommendations as well. And so it'll break it down for you what you need specifically and how often it needs to be applied. However, if for some reason, you're beyond that soil test recommendation, there are some general guidelines for applying fertilizer. And so for that first year, it's about an ounce of a 12-4-8 formulation fertilizer. That's per plant, and that's once the plant begins growing. You really don't want to apply fertilizer until you can see that a plant is actively growing. And so for blueberries, that's somewhere around the March or April timeframe. Again, once you can see those leaves on the plant, then it's a good time to fertilize. And again, you want to broadcast it around the plant. So generally in about a 2-foot circle around. Make sure that you're not dumping it at the base of the plant. Again, that can lead to root damage. And then that first year, you want to make sure that you do 2 other repeat applications at the same rate in the same manner. So for May and July. That second year, you're going to double that amount, same fertilizer, and that's going to be on a per plant basis. And it will begin at the same time you did it on that first year. So around March or April, in the same manner, you're going to broadcast it around, and you'll repeat again in May and July. And then that third year and beyond, you'll want to increase each year by 1 ounce per plant, but you want to tap that off at about 6 ounces per plant after that. You don't really want to go beyond that rate. But again, I'll have to mention, you want to make sure that you're following your soil test recommendations first. So when it comes to watering, as with most plants, this is going to be really essential for the first year, and for blueberries even into that second year. And that is because, again, blueberries have a very shallow root system. Oftentimes with mulching, you will see that the roots will start growing into the mulch. So they will be above ground level. Therefore, they're really easy to dry out. And so whether we receive rainfall or not throughout the growing season, you really want to make sure that your blueberries are receiving anywhere between 1 to 1.5 inches of water per week. Again, if we have rain, great. But by the end of the week, you want to make sure that those blueberries are at least getting that amount. And that's really important, especially for optimum fruit production when you're in that third year and fruit's really starting to form. You want to make sure that you are watering, especially during those dry periods. And that is because, especially for blueberries, if they are not getting the amount of water that they need for optimum growth and development, especially for fruit production, the plant will actually take water from the berries. And that's what you don't want, because that's going to start affecting fruit quality. And so really making sure that they are getting the water that they need is important. So a few slides back, we talked about pruning at planting. Well, each year, some planting will be required, and that's for several reasons. And that's anywhere from really allowing sunlight to get into the canopy or the shrub. This is going to help not only with fruit production, but air circulation as well. So helping to potentially stave off any disease pressures out there, but also this is going to allow for ease of harvest. If you remember back to that introduction slide, these plants can get up to 12 to 15 feet tall. And for most of us, that's a little too tall for us to properly harvest our blueberry bushes. So oftentimes pruning those back to about 6 feet each year will really help ease harvest. And so again, not only will pruning help with better fruit quality, you'll find that it actually increases with pruning, but it also makes it easier to pick. And so once those blueberry bushes, as long as they're, younger than 6 years old, you'll only remove say your weak or damaged limbs. So same with pruning other shrubs or other plants, you want to make sure that you're, of course, removing those weak or damaged limbs first. And as long as those plants are still young, that's all you really need to do. Otherwise, after harvest, if they are producing a fruit crop and they are above 6 feet tall, you'll want to prune those back. Something to remember with blueberries is that the flowers and the fruit are actually produced on wood that is grown the year before. And so if you are going to prune to reduce height, it's always best to do that after harvest. And so then again, you wouldn't prune until winter dormancy, where you will go in and remove weak or damaged limbs. Now, once they get to be a certain age, which is over 6 years old, you'll really want to start considering renewal pruning. And this is where you go in and actually remove some of the canes along with the weak and damaged shoots as well. And so with renewal pruning, again, this is when they reach about 6 years old. You'll go in and you'll remove anywhere from 1 to 3 of the largest canes. Again, this is in the winter, so during the dormant period, and you'll cut those back to ground level. What this is going to do is this is going to stimulate new growth, which is what you're wanting for fruit production. You can actually get better quality fruit from these younger canes. They're also more productive as well. So you don't want to hold on to some of the older, more spent canes. However, when you're doing this, you want to make sure that you're not removing more than 20% of the actual wood or canes within that particular shrub. Unfortunately, that stresses the plant too much. So generally the recommendation is anywhere from 1 to 3, depending on how many canes you have with that particular plant. Again, this just really opens the shrub up for air circulation, but it allows light into, which continues to just increase that fruit quality. So other than pruning, you really want to make sure that you are controlling weeds as well. I mentioned earlier, but blueberries do not compete well for their necessities, such as water and nutrients. This all goes back to them having that really shallow root system. Therefore, you want to make sure that the weeds and the grass around your blueberries are held off. You really don't want them around the base of your blueberry. And so there's several ways to go about this. You can physically remove the weeds each season, each year, but that can be labor intensive. And because the roots are so shallow and so near that soil surface, you want to be mindful that you're not damaging the roots. And so oftentimes the best option with blueberries is to mulch. And we'll look at that next. But again, not good competitors. So you really want to make sure that you're giving them the best foundation for berry production. So other than helping with weed control, mulch can actually help in retaining moisture, regulating the soil temperature. It can add organic matter back to the soil as it decomposes, which also can help acidify the soil, keeping the soil within that pH range that blueberries really like. And so an easy way to accomplish this is just by applying mulches such as pine bark, pine straw, composted wood chips around the base of your plant in a 3 to 4 inch layer. And that really spreads out about 2 to 3 feet wide. So the area that you really don't want to have weeds or grass growing in to begin with. And so again, another option to not only control weeds, but also add back to the soil and help acidify the soil. So the last part of care and maintenance that I really wanted to highlight tonight is pests and diseases. However, one of the benefits of growing a native fruit crop is that they're really they're really easy to grow in that you're not having to constantly fight pests and diseases. Blueberries can actually be grown successfully without a lot of care on your end, other than some of the factors we mentioned earlier. And so most of the time, the issues that you do see with blueberries are not serious, and they're often easily corrected by just changing some of your management practices. And so oftentimes one of the biggest pests that I actually hear about is not an insect, it's not a disease, it's actually a vertebrate pest, and it's birds. A lot of homeowners unfortunately have to deal with birds, especially with some of the earlier blooming varieties. Birds can be a nuisance, and so you'll really want to mitigate that by using things such as netting for control. Unfortunately, there are not a lot of options when it comes to control of birds, and depending on the birds that you have around you, damage will vary, but unfortunately, the only way to really control this pest is through the use of netting. So even though I mentioned there's not a whole lot of pests with blueberry production on the homeowner front, there are some insects that I wanted you to be aware of. We're not going to go into the specifics of the control for these particular ones, again, because oftentimes it's not a huge issue for home gardens, but again, I just wanted to make you aware that they are out there. The first one is cranberry fruitworm, blueberry maggot, Japanese beetle, scale, leaf rollers, plum curculio, bud mites, and stem borers. And again, just to make you aware that these are out there, these are some of the common ones that you may hear about, but again, not a huge issue. Some of the diseases are things like Phomopsis, Botrytis blossom blight, anthracnose, mummyberry, leaf spot, root rot, powdery mildew, and Botrosphaeria. Again, if you see any of these pests, please reach out to your local extension office. They'll be happy to help you. But again, these are typically not a concern, just to have them on your radar. And again, reach out to your extension office. They'll be happy to help you with control measures for these insects and diseases. All right, so we're getting towards the end of our talk tonight. Before I wrap things up, really want to take a look at harvest, and then we'll look at a few tips to help you have a successful planting. And so typically with your blueberries, they will produce a small crop either by the second or the third year. So be a little bit patient with them. After petal fall for blueberries, typically you will see them ready for harvest anywhere from 60 to 90 days. That really depends on which variety you're growing and also what cultivar. They each have their own requirements, but typically you will know when the berries are getting ripe because they will turn blue about 3 to 6 days before they're ready for picking. And so you'll actually start picking when you have about 20% of your berries turning blue. And so just to really help mitigate post-harvest issues, you want to make sure that your berries are dry before you start picking. So generally your berries are going to ripen over a 2 to 3 week period, depending on which cultivar you are growing. And keep in mind that the berries are not all going to ripen at the same time, and they will also not ripen after you pick them off of the bush. So sometimes it's better to just wait a day or two if you're not too sure. Because again, their quality will not improve after it's picked. So you want to hold them on the bush as long as you possibly can. Therefore, you want to pick them about every 7 to 10 days. That's a good time frame, about once a week. Once about 20% of them start turning blue. And so as long as your berry bushes are properly maintained throughout the year, they're getting the nutrients they need, the water they need, making sure that they are pruned as they should be, you should be getting pretty good yields, especially by your 6th year. For rabbit eyes is around about 2 gallons per plant. And so just a few tips to have successful blueberry planting. It really starts with selecting the appropriate variety. So going back to the 3 varieties, you have Southern Highbush, you have Northern Highbush, and Rabbit Eye. Rabbit Eye, again, is always a really good choice, especially for home gardens, in that they're pest and disease tolerant. Most times they're also drought tolerant. And so, again, not a whole lot of management having to go into fruit production for this particular variety. Something to note with Rabbit Eye, however, again, they will need a partner. So make sure if you are growing Rabbit Eye that you have a partner that has an overlapping bloom time with the other blueberry bush you have selected. Again, start with a good foundation, a good site. Make sure that you are having that soil tested so you are aware of what the soil pH levels are, that you are looking at drainage. Again, they do not like to have wet feet. And if for some reason drainage is not ideal in a site that seems suitable, you have options. You can try containers. You can also try growing them in a raised bed as well. And then lastly, you want to be mindful of late season freezes, which are often an issue with some of those early season varieties. You also want to be mindful of over fertilization. Again, blueberries are really sensitive to too much fertilizer. And then lastly, one of the biggest pests that you'll probably have to deal with are birds. But again, for the most part, not a lot of issues that you will see with blueberries as far as insects and diseases go. And so that is all I have for you tonight for backyard blueberries. And Yanni, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you all so much for letting me be here tonight.
Thank you, Ashley. I think we do have some questions in the chat box. So
Yeah.
I think we can get them answered now. And if you have like more questions, you can type it in the chat box. So I think the first question is about the cross-pollination. So you talk about the different varieties like the Northern Highbush, Southern Highbush, and the Rabbit Eye. So the question is, if you have one of the hardier varieties like Rabbit Eye, while these other varieties pollinate them.
So we'll say like a Northern Highbush pollinate. So that one's going to be kind of a tricky situation. And so oftentimes if you're growing Northern Highbush, you're not also growing Rabbit Eye because they don't grow in the same settings. And so if you're growing a Rabbit Eye, you really need to make sure that your pollinator is also a Rabbit Eye, because again, those bloom periods need to be overlapping. And with Northern Highbush, they have a higher chilling requirement. So the bloom period time is not going to be the same as with Rabbit Eye.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes. And if we didn't explain that question clearly, you can give us some follow-up question. So the next question I think is about participants. They come from the northern areas or like the northern zones. So do you have some typical varieties like you can recommend for one of our participants in Minnesota, or they have to check their local extension?
So my recommendation is to check with their local extension office. Unfortunately, the varieties I'm most familiar with are going to be those that can be grown here in Georgia in the Southeast.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is about the growing location of blueberry. So you mentioned that you better grow it in a bit elevated area. So this question is, are the chain link fences okay? Like that area okay to grow blueberry?
Yeah, with a chain link fence, you don't really have an obstruction to air moving in and out of that particular area. So a chain link fence is fine. As long as there's not a solid area right next to that blueberry bush that will prevent air from flowing in, it should be fine. So a chain link fence, yeah, that should be okay.
Okay, so the next question is about like the plant resource. So they have questions. Is Home Depot, Lowe's, or Pike Nursery their plant reputable? Or do you have any recommended sources for the participants to get their blueberry plants?
So I would check with your local nurseries first. Sometimes the box stores do have cultivars that are suited for our area, but sometimes they do not. And so it always helps to start with local first because they know the ones that are suited for your area, and oftentimes they'll carry them. If you're not finding what you are looking for, oftentimes you can ask them if they can start carrying that particular cultivar or variety if you're not finding it. But it never hurts to check the box stores. Again, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You just really need to read the plant tag that comes with that plant.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So the next question, what type of container would you recommend and what size is the best?
So the best size that is best is starting out with a 2-foot wide, 2-foot tall container. And so as long as your container has drainage holes and will hold a potting mix or a soil mix in it, it is suitable to grow a blueberry. And so oftentimes though, as they age, it might behoove them to go to a larger size container. They'll just have to pay attention to plant growth, and as that plant ages, if it needs to be moved up to a larger size container or not. And again, make sure that you're using that 50-50 mix of pine bark mulch and peat moss. It really helps as a growing environment for blueberries in containers.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, birds get most of my blueberries. What is the best source for netting?
So netting, you can find it in lots of different locations. I don't necessarily have a prime place for finding bird netting, but you can go to any of the gardening sites. Sometimes you can find them at garden centers as well. So you just really have to check around. There's cloth options available. There's plastic netting that's available. So you really just want to choose what's going to be best for you in your situation.
Do you think that fabric, we call that the like the crop cover, that fabric, do you think that fabric can be covered on the blueberry? Do you think that will block the sunlight necessarily, or they can use that?
If that's the one I'm thinking about, that's probably going to be too heavy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so they're going to want something light, but that the bird can't get through. And sometimes it's easier just to drape it over the bush. But for some people, that seems to be too much of a cumbersome thing for them. And so sometimes it's better to kind of elevate the netting above the shrub so it's not actually on the shrub, but it's still around and offering protection.
Okay. Next question, how well blueberry do in Georgia clay soil?
So because blueberries are native to our area, as long as you are mixing in that amendment to your potting hole, most of the time they'll do fine. If you find yourself questioning how well drainage is, you can always try to do a percolation test, which is where you dig a hole about 12 feet, or not, excuse me, not 12 feet, 12 inches wide, 12 inches deep, and then see how water exchanges in that hole. If you feel like it's not draining fast enough, you can always try to do a raised bed situation, or you can try growing in a container. But for the most part, if you find that drainage is okay in your clay soil, then I would try planting directly in the soil, making sure that you amend it. But if not, try a raised bed or a container.
Thank you. Next question, is there a specific variety or cultivar best for containers?
So there are some dwarfing cultivars out there. I'm not too familiar with those and how they will hold up in the containers. You can try them, check them out. But as long as you're giving them the space and the nutrients they need, they have that acidic soil environment, they should do just fine as long as you're not limiting their root structure in a smaller container.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What are some examples of plants with overlapping bloom times?
So what are some plants with some overlapping bloom times?
Yeah,
And so
examples.
Yeah, so you can actually go online and find some of the overlapping bloom times. And so sorry, I don't have it on me right now, but you can find those out there. I want to say that Brightwell does good with some of the mid to late season ones. You'll have to check and see. Premier is another good one, but you'll have to pay attention to that one because it's an early season. So it'll do okay, I think, with Alapaha and Austin. But again, you can find that information out there. Typically, if you stay within the early season and choose another early season cultivar, or if you stay in the mid to late season and choose another mid to late season cultivar, they should cross-pollinate each other.
Okay, thank you. So next question. I think this participant, they got like 2-year-old potted blueberries, and how can I determine which variety or cultivar they are?
So it should be on the plant tag. Do they still have the plant tag?
No, they don't have the plant tag.
So if they don't have the plant tag, it's going to be really hard to determine what they have. We do not have a way of necessarily being able to narrow that down for them.
Okay. But can you give this participant probably a guidelines to determine if it's a early season bloomer or it's a late season bloomer? So I think at least that's kind of like we can narrow down the range of her plants, right?
I mean, it depends because the chilling hour requirement is going to differ per cultivar. So, I mean, if it's blooming in March, then it's probably an early season. In early March is probably an early season cultivar.
Okay. And the next question, will these slides be available? So I have already recorded this lecture. So I will take off tomorrow, but I will send y'all a review email this Friday. But if you need these presentation slides, you have to email me individually. And Ashley, can you share that with me or?
I can. And okay. I will also say too, most of this information can be found in the Home Gardens Blueberry publication put out through UGA. So really good resource.
Okay, so I think we have one question from our Master Gardener. I run a Master Gardener demonstration site at Dunwoody Community Garden. We have been successfully growing 7 blueberry shrubs, each in half whiskey barrels. The shrubs are now 10 to 12 years old. We keep them pruned to approximately 3 to 5 foot high, and they are protected in a large blueberry cage. How long do you think we will be able to keep growing these shrubs in half whiskey barrels? Thank you.
And so as long as they're doing okay in those half whiskey barrels, they should be okay. As long as you're not seeing issues popping up with them, such as cultural issues like leaf droppage or anything like that, I think it's fine to just wait them out and see how they do. I mean, if they're that old already in those size containers, they should be just fine. What is the
average life range for a blueberry plant?
It depends on how it's managed, but roughly around 15 years.
15 years. Okay.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if they're already that old and they're doing fine, I would just keep doing what you're doing.
Okay. So if you have any more questions, you are welcome to type it. Okay. How do you harvest the seeds from blueberries?
And so are they wanting seeds for propagation? Because blueberries typically aren't propagated by seed.
Okay, so they more like vegetative propagation,
Mhm.
right? Okay. Yeah.
Right.
So any more questions? You can type it in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself to ask your questions as well. We will wait 2 more minutes. So how do you grow new plants? How do you grow new blueberries if not from seeds?
And so it's typically vegetative propagation, meaning using plant parts. So it's often kind of tricky to do. And so it's best to just purchase new plants instead of trying to do it yourself.
Yeah, so for the woody plants, normally if we want to get started, we will go to nursery and get like a seedlings, or like we call them young trees, instead of just kind of like sowing a seeds, wait them to germinate, because they require a lot of environmental conditions to germinate, you know, to successfully survive there. So that's normally how we start a woody or fruit trees in the garden. I don't know if I explained that question clearly. If not, you can unmute yourself, or you can give us some follow-up information.
Yeah, with most, just to go off of what Yanni just said, with most fruit crops, they are vegetatively propagated, meaning they are started from plant parts and not seed. Most oftentimes with seed, it's not true to seed, so you don't get those same characteristics that you're looking for over and over. And so it's called asexual propagation, but it's using plant parts to make sure that you have essentially clones of that specific fruit crop that you're trying to grow.
So we have one more question coming up. A net for birds, a fence. So any natural remedies that prone to work to repel like deers, critters, soap, dog hair, cinnamon, food items? Have you have any success on that?
No, so far I've not heard of anyone really having success with some of those home remedies. Really the only way to control birds and other vertebrates from getting to your berries is using netting.
Okay. And I do see there is one of our agents. He got that very cheap, you know, like it's kind of like a tea bag. It's kind of like a fabric bag. And in that bag, I think he got some like the deer tolerant material to put it in that bag. And then what he did is he actually hanging that bag on the branches. So he said it's kind of like he used that method on his muscadine, like some fruit crops. It seems like it's working. So probably you can try that to see if that works, because that's kind of like what I heard.
Yeah, deer repellent will work for a while, but once they wise up, you got to start all over again.
Yeah. Okay. Any more questions? You can leave it in the chat box. If not, I think that is all we have tonight. And thank you so much for staying with us.